Then, of course, I will share this once we're done to Twitter. I refuse to call it X because it's stupid to call it X.
It is stupid.
All right, mute, and we are rolling. All right. So thank you everyone for coming. This is our most recent popular culture dialogue. This is on the current state of Westerns, and I see that Chris just brought one of the cats in. We're here today with Brian Brems and Christopher Olson to talk about Westerns and what's happening with the genre these days. And they are both contributors to this, which may probably look weird because I have it mirrored, but this is the award-winning collection, The Good, the Bad, and the Ancient. Essays on the Greco-Roman influence in Westerns. I can read backwards, so look at this go. So welcome, gentlemen, to this conversation. Tell us a little bit about yourselves and what brings you here. And Brian, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Brian Brems, and I'm a professor of English at the College of DuPage, where I teach film studies courses in film history, film art, film and literature, film genres. I just did last spring a film directors and authorship course on John Carpenter. Yeah, it was very fun. And then my most recent book is a self-authored volume called The Films of Walter Hill, Another Time, Another Place. And so for that book, which was published with Lexington last year, I conducted a series of interviews with Walter Hill during the pandemic. Basically, he was not working and neither was I. So we spent some time talking over Zoom for about 24 total hours, covering the duration of his career. And so I talked to Walter Hill for that book, along with some actors who'd been in his films, including David Patrick Kelly and James Remar, who were both in The Warriors. And Walter was nice enough to hook me up with Sigourney Weaver as well to talk about Alien. So yeah, so that's my most recent book, but I've written a lot on Westerns and other genres as well, including horror films. So just glad to be here talking about Westerns with both of you.
Wonderful. And I think you just made Chris very jealous with the
Oh yeah.
conversing with Walter Hill and
Oh, yeah.
Sigourney
Sure.
Weaver. So,
Yeah.
Chris, I know you've been here before, but what brings you to this conversation?
Well, for those who don't know, my name is Christopher J. Olson. I am now Dr. Olson. I just successfully defended my dissertation, which is all about the filmmaker Nicholas Winding Refn, whose films draw a lot on the films of Walter Hill, as well as Westerns and other things like that. I'm a longtime Western fan. Specifically, I like Italian Westerns the most, but I'm also a fan of traditional Hollywood Westerns. I've written about Westerns, as Carrie said. I have a chapter in Good, Bad, and the Ancient. I also have a chapter in Sue Matheson's upcoming book on 21st century Westerns, looking at masculinity in the film The Proposition. And like Brian, I come from a film studies background mainly. My PhD is in media, cinema, and digital studies, but I focus primarily on film, especially cult cinema, which is one of the reasons why I think I gravitate toward Italian Westerns. But I have my book on the 100 greatest cult films. I co-wrote a book with Carrie on exorcism cinema. I just like cinema in general, but I gravitate towards Westerns because the genre is so malleable, and even if it's not in the public conscious right now, it's still there because of how it can be adapted into different idioms and things like that.
And I mean, I grew up with Westerns because my mom is a huge Bonanza fan to the point where she became, for a time, the only officially licensed author of Bonanza fan fiction, essentially, but Bonanza novels. She even met with, I'm forgetting his name, but the guy who created Bonanza. And I actually met him too. He was a really nice guy. So I've been around Westerns a lot. And there seems to be something in the Western genre about how it's very cyclical, where it seems to be very popular for a short amount of time or a long amount of time, depending on maybe the medium, but then it goes away and it kind of has the cyclical nature. So maybe with that in mind, what do you see as the current state of Westerns? Are we, have we had a popular cycle recently? I'm thinking especially like with the success of Yellowstone and Justified, and now Justified's coming back, or are we on the downswing? I mean, what do you see happening with the Western genre right now?
Well, I can speak to some of that, particularly the Justified piece of it, because Chris, I'm glad to hear that you're going to be joining the new collection that Sue's putting together as well, working on the proposition because my chapter is on Justified.
Nice.
So yeah. So I love Justified as a show, I think for a few reasons. The biggest of which I think is that it exemplifies the Western tradition's migration into other genres and spaces, which I think is kind of one of the big hallmarks of Westerns, is that they've basically, in order to survive at all, have had to change the way that they look and the way that they feel and the kinds of stories and character archetypes that they rely on. They've had to complicate those things in a variety of ways. And I think Justified is an illustration of that in its depiction of the central character, Raylan Givens, who's portrayed by Timothy Oliphant. He's a Western styled character, self-consciously so. Like he's wears this ridiculous Stetson hat that is a part of his self-conception as a gun-toting lawman with a quick draw, like that's how he builds himself up. It's a performance not only that Oliphant is giving as Raylan, but that Raylan is giving as a U.S. Marshal. And I think that the series is deeply interested in these kinds of questions. So many of the other characters inside the world of Justified tend to see what Raylan is doing, wearing the Stetson hat and cocking his leg and putting his hand on the hilt of his gun and his gun belt as performative. They call him on it constantly through dialogue. They're aware, just as Raylan is, that he is manufacturing a Western styled persona. And I think that by placing that man out of time in a contemporary setting where he's both out of place because he's deliberately kind of a throwback to an earlier period, but he's also crucially kind of been brought inside of an institution. He's not a on his own rugged individualist in the manner of classic Westerns. He's not Shane, he's not the gunslinger who comes into town, makes it safe for the farmers, and then leaves again. He's got the power of the state that grants him the authority to commit violence. And I think Justified is one of the shows that is set in a law enforcement world that is most openly concerned about the power of the state to use violence as embodied by a figure like Raylan, who seems to enjoy it, or at least kind of embraces his skill at it in a way that other conflicted police protagonists have no compunctions about that kind of stuff. They're sort of either perfectly fine with using their weapons, or they kind of struggle with it. And Raylan is kind of a little bit in the middle. And I think that's especially the case in the most recent revival of Justified City Primeval, the limited series, which I think my guess is not going to be so limited based on what happens in the last 5 minutes of that episode of the finale, is that they're probably going to be getting all the fellas back again to do another one. But I think it's an interesting example of how Westerns have had to adopt some of the principles of other genres that have allowed them to survive.
Mhm.
You know, and we're gonna feel free to jettison some of the overt iconography of the Western in order
Mhm.
to continue to exist and take some of these character archetypes and modify and create
Mhm.
variation out of them so that it can continue to have meaning for audiences in a contemporary context.
I think Oliphant is also one of those interesting transmedia personas, maybe to say, because he seems to be playing similar characters when you see him, in Justified and Deadwood, but also in The Mandalorian. He
Mhm.
has that same type of presence. And I don't know, it'd be kind of fun to do like a
Tarantino casts him as Jim Stacy in Once Upon a Time
mm,
in Hollywood is
mm,
because he's trying to make the audience aware of the power of Jim Stacy as an actor, um, you know, and what he represented to audiences at that time on TV by basically casting the most famous of the television sheriffs that we have now in that role. I think is very deliberate on his part. And I think that,
mm,
Tarantino is obviously somebody who's totally cognizant of star persona and the way that's
mm,
used even from the beginning with what he's doing with Travolta in Pulp Fiction and
mm,
resurrecting Pam Grier and Robert Forster for Jackie Brown and on, all of the kind of awareness that Tarantino has of star persona inside genre. I think he's totally aware of what Oliphant
mm,
represents to audiences as this kind of TV lawman for sure is what
mm.
he's doing in that role in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That's why he's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Once Upon a Time in Hollywood up because that immediately came to mind when we were talking about Oliphant as well as Deadwood, because Deadwood, aside from Mystery Science Theater 3000, that's my favorite television show ever
Sure.
is Deadwood. Um, and I want to just kind of build off of what Brian was saying about the Western, having to uh, change the genre in some ways. Because I think since the turn of the century, we have seen more sort of genre mixing in the Western.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of things like Firefly,
Mhm.
where it's sci-fi, but it's very much a Western.
Yeah.
Or even stuff like Cowboy Bebop and what was the other big Western sci-fi anime? The one that was it Trigun? No, or
Well,
Trigun was one of them. Outlaw Star.
Outlaw
That's the
Star
one
was
I'm
the
thinking.
worst. Yeah.
So Outlaw Star. But even, as we go forward in the 21st century, and these are all kind of older, but, I think of stuff like No Country for Old Men, which is very much a straightforward kind of crime, like noir, that the Coens are really known for, but it's mixing those Western trappings.
Yeah.
And even as like the Western is sort of mixing genres, it's also crossing more types of um, media because the Western has always been a very cross media kind of thing with like the dime novels and TV and movies. We don't see it quite so much in movies these days. It's more kind of on television, like with stuff like Yellowstone and Justified and all that. But it's also like we see a lot of Westerns popping up in comics, but they're often weird Westerns.
Mm.
Stuff like The Sixth Gun,
Yeah.
or there was an Amazon limited series when they were like, doing one called Blackburn Burrow, which was very Lovecraftian Western. Or, it's as a DLC where you fight zombies and things like that. So I think what we've seen since the turn of the century is pushing its tendrils into other types of genres to keep itself relevant in some ways, I think.
Well, is it that, like, what is it doing then to be relevant? Like, why is it still maintaining a core aspect that we can identify as the Western, but marrying it to this other genre? Um, is it still like because okay, I think particularly about how one key aspect of the Western is the relationship to American national identity, the American monomyth, and all of that. I mean, do we still see that when we are seeing these newer Westerns that are doing cross-genre pollinating?
It's a great question. I don't know. I think that one of the things that I sort of when I was younger, I think I would have responded to quite well as a film viewer is these kinds of, you know, genre hybridity and genre
Mm,
mixing and things like that. But I think at a certain point, we've kind of taken that as far as it can go, and it becomes its sort of pastiche that, I think people, when they think about pastiche, are sort of using that term in a pejorative sense a lot of times, that it's just an accumulation in this postmodern way of all these other things that, when you add them all up, don't really amount to anything. They're just signifiers and reference to other stories. Like, I think about like a movie that is definably not a Western in any significant way, but it does have a tiny Western reference, which is in the final sequence of the first Matrix film, where Agent Smith and Neo
Mm,
fight in the subway, and the Wachowskis do a shot or two of the two of them at opposite ends of the subway platform, and I don't know where the wind is coming from, but a wind blows a piece of paper across them in between, and the
mhm,
shots are very much just like, well, let's do a Western gunfight
mhm,
setup here. And it's like, okay, as a viewer, I spot that reference. I see what you're doing. I get that you're referencing a Western setup, but I kind of don't know why. I don't know what the value of it is in that moment. And I think that, this is just the first example that came to me, but I think that when you take that kind of generic referencing and pastiche approach to its logical end, it becomes a kind of Ouroboros, where it's like you're referencing these ideas in Westerns simply because they exist in Westerns, as
mm,
opposed to having any larger cultural currency or
mhm,
meaning in the way that they may have in a classical period. Now, I haven't seen Yellowstone. It's just one of the things that's just not been on my list
mhm,
yet. I'm sure that I'll get to it eventually, but I know that as just like a baseline of what it's about, that it's carrying on in the tradition of, cattle empire westerns like
mhm,
Broken Lance or Red River, or, those kinds of things where you've got your big, strong patriarchal figure.
mhm,
And these are stories that are wrapped up in questions and concerns of American empire. And I think by virtue of their necessity, like the things that Howard Hawks was saying about American empire in 1948 with Red River cannot be the same things that Taylor Sheridan is saying about American Empire
mhm,
in 2018 when he launches Yellowstone. Like, they just cannot be the same things because too much time has passed in between those points. Um, so I think I struggle sometimes with these questions of whether references to and the migration of Westerns into other genres serves any greater purpose, or
mm,
if those generic references have become emptied of their value,
mm,
and that they are just simply designed to carry a symbolic meaning that
mhm,
goes back to the genre itself rather than its application to any larger idea, concept, or principle that has any meaning for an audience. I don't
mhm.
know. I think that's an individual case to case basis. But I think
Although,
in general, a larger
mhm,
shift towards this kind of pastiching is increasingly, to me at least,
mm.
feels empty.
Although now that you mentioned that about the Matrix, I do wonder if we could read the robot civilization as barbaric and then Neo as a civilizing influence in trying to free humans. But then
Mhm.
the entire trilogy kind of undercuts that, so it doesn't
Sure.
really read quite as well.
It almost goes the other way, where
Yeah,
the
yeah,
humans are the barbarians and the robots are the civilizing agent, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
I think to build off what Brian was saying a little bit, I think it is a case by case basis, but I think part of what a lot of creators these days are doing are using the Western tropes to sort of comment on or critique
Mm,
ideas about things like individualism and masculinity
mhm,
because at least for me, and I know there are other scholars who thought this, and this was kind of what I wrote my master's thesis about, was like the fact that the cowboy, the gunslinger, has become a very sort of recognizable cinematic
Mhm.
archetype. And so, like, one of the movies that I wrote about for my master's thesis was Drive, the Nicholas Winding Refn film, and how it is sort of a 21st century Western because the central figure is so much a man with no name
Mhm.
character. In fact, the character doesn't have a name. He's only ever referred to as the kid or the driver. And Refn, from what I can tell, is using that referent to, and here we go with the
Yeah.
referential stuff that
Reference.
this goes to my dissertation defense, but the idea that Refn is using this as a referent for American masculinity to sort of critique this idea of violent masculinity
Mhm.
and its outcomes and things like that. I think when you look at these individual pieces, you can see the different types of critiques that are coming up because the Western is, like you said, it's so much a cornerstone of
Mhm.
American national identity. Um, I think, though, what's interesting in the 21st century is how much the superhero has sort of
Yeah.
supplanted that in
Mhm.
some ways, because a lot of people look at comic books as like a quintessential
Mhm.
American art form.
Mhm.
But if you go back and you look at Western characters, they're so, they're like sort of preternatural abilities. They can
Yeah.
like whip out their gun and shoot five guys without aiming and all that stuff, or they can get into a fight with a whole bar full of people and be okay.
Mhm.
Their DNA is very much in the superhero in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. So I think we just, you know, it's not like people aren't doing one thing with the Western. I think if you look at all these different examples, you see different types of commentary.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's something that's interesting about it is, I wrestle with this comparison with superhero movies and westerns all the time. Like it's just, in the context of teaching in the last like 10 years or so,
Mhm.
like, you kind of have to have some baseline familiarity with contemporary superhero films because frankly, as a teacher, you're going to get asked about it.
Mhm.
I feel like that's declining a little bit now. I think that the student population, at least the ones I'm getting at this point, who are, 18, 19, 20, like they're kind of tired of it, and you can tell.
Mhm.
But I think inevitably, whenever I teach a Western, in one of my film history sections this semester, we did The Gunfighter, the Henry
Mhm.
King film with Gregory Peck from 1950. And one of the key things I think that we talked about was the ways in which, because we talk about like, okay, here's a Western, here's an example of it, here's its archetypes. Now, where did they go? Why don't they
Mhm.
exist anymore? At
Mhm.
least in this form. We always talk about decline, and one of the things that whenever we have this discussion always comes up is, well, they've kind of migrated into superhero films. And I
Mhm.
think there is something to that. I would not go so far as to say that your average superhero film is as well made or interesting as your average classic Hollywood Western. I don't think they are.
Mhm.
And like that's just, I guess, to taste. But, that's my opinion. But at the same time, I do think if we're thinking about what purpose Westerns served for audiences and for filmmakers, Kara, you've brought up a couple of times the idea of myth, and I
Mhm.
think that's crucial, right? I mean, Westerns are really American mythology in the way
Mhm.
that, you've got Zeus and Poseidon and all that stuff for Greek mythology. Like Westerns are American mythology. That's really what they are. I think that the needs that they were serving was to provide audiences with stories of threat and resolution, threat
Mhm.
and resolution. And I think that at the basic level, though I don't think their artistry is impressive, I do think that that's what superhero films are
Mhm.
doing. I mean, if you look at the basic plot line of a Western, it's town is threatened, somebody comes to stop it.
Mhm.
That's a superhero film too. It's just on
Mhm.
a global or urban scale, right? If it's, Gotham or, the intergalactic, the whole world is going to be snapped to death or whatever. Like it's the same basic concept, just bigger and louder and
Mhm.
spread out across the entire globe or the galaxy. Um, and so I think it is serving that kind of base need, at
Mhm.
least the superhero film. And so I think that, in that broad sense, I think they are drawing on some similar core story structures and character archetypes as Westerns. And I think you,
Mhm.
you you see it more broadly represented or more specifically represented, I mean, in characters like Chris Pratt's guy in the Guardians of the Galaxy, who's very
Yeah.
clearly uh, 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 I mean, he's a Han Solo archetype, but then you get into the Russian nesting doll aspect of reference to reference
Mhm.
to reference, where Han Solo was John Wayne, like
Yeah.
so it's just and on and on and on back into history where you get each of these successive references is a half-life of the previous one,
Mhm.
So I think that there's something to say about the relationship between Westerns and superhero films, even if their level of quality, I don't think is always on the same par.
Well, and I know Chris and I have been talking about the fact of one of the reasons why the Guardian movies, that trilogy, I guess, seems to have done better than maybe some of the other franchises in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because in a way they're not even necessarily superheroes. They are these, rugged individualists who somehow come together and form a family, but
Hmm.
they're not really positioned as superheroes like traditionally.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, talking about the reference to reference, you basically then you have Guardians referencing Firefly, which in a way was referencing Star Trek, which in a way is referencing Wagon Train. Yeah, it just keeps
Hmm.
going back and back.
Right. Right. Yeah, or their collection of, ragtag doofuses is in
Mhm.
some way a Magnificent Seven,
Yep.
going back to Seven Samurai, which, I think
Mhm.
in a couple of weeks we're going to be watching the Zack Snyder Rebel Moon, right? Which is
Oh yeah.
the film that they wouldn't let him make as a Star Wars, but that he initially pitched it as basically it's a Magnificent Seven is Star Wars basically. And so
Which
it's
we've already had, and it was a
yeah,
Roger Corman film,
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Battle
Exactly.
Beyond the Stars.
which
Yes.
has Western elements in it too,
Of
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
course,
I
yeah.
mean, the fact that Robert Vaughn is in Battle Beyond the Stars and was in the Magnificent Seven. I mean,
Mhm.
that's a clear
Yeah.
reference point.
Mhm.
But what's
Mhm.
really interesting to me, at least, and this is, a little bit of what I wrote about in my chapter for Sue Matheson's upcoming anthology, but the fact that you mentioned how it goes to the Magnificent Seven, which then goes to the Seven Samurai. There are so many international westerns in the 21st
Mhm.
century that are produced far beyond the borders of the United States, whether it's, like you go to France and you can see the movie Blueberry with Vincent Castle as the
Mhm.
title character. You can look to Japan to see Takashi Miike's Sukiyaki Western Django. You can look to South Korea to see The Good, the Bad, and the Weird, which is obviously a reference to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or even to Thailand for Tears of the Black Tiger. And suddenly you have all the like the Western sort of mono narrative has diffused into these other countries that are using that story to sort of interrogate their own histories in a lot
Mhm.
of ways. And it's not just like a new phenomenon. I mean, you can look back to the Italian westerns. There were the Russian red westerns that came out in like the 70s, I think it was,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. So there's the diffusion of the Western story and how applicable it is to so many different situations. I find that really fascinating in the 21st century, especially.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's actually gotten more interesting about Westerns is that, it's often written about in, your classic studies of genre, as a as an example of one of the more recognizable and stable genres because of its conventions, because of its iconography. It's like, how do we know we're watching a Western? Well, there's a guy in a cowboy hat and a horse, and it's usually a good indicator. It's written like alongside musicals as being like,
Mm,
having a very clear set of generic reference points that, it's also one of the genres that studio executives talked about. Like, unlike, say, something like film noir, which was not a term that any
mm,
was used on a production side until, the late 60s and early 70s, when it had, become a point of reference itself with the neo period.
mm,
The Western was a term, an industry term. And I think that one thing that's kind of happened, obviously, is because Westerns have become sort of a thing that is, at least for the most part, to be avoided. Like, it's thought of as having this kind of thing that's like, well, it's not a Western really,
mhm,
it's something else. It's perceived, at least, as being something for, you know, your grandfather clicking through channels on Sunday and
mhm,
stumbling across the Sons of Katie Elder on AMC, like that's kind of what it's thought to be, as this very antiquated form of storytelling.
mhm,
And I think that one of the things that has benefited Western motifs and Western ideas is it had to learn how to fracture.
mm,
It had to learn how to go to all these other different places out of necessity in order to survive.
mm,
And I think that one of the places that it most obviously went is just into the mainstream action cinema in the
mm,
70s and the 80s, where, you've got essentially any Westerns that are being made in the 70s are of the revisionist variety, the
mhm,
deconstructive variety, where we're going to take all of these myths and ideas that were heralded in the classic period, and we're just going to turn them inside out.
mhm,
So, we're going to take McCabe and Mrs. Miller and take this,
mhm,
gunfight that's happening at the end of McCabe and Mrs. Miller that's supposed to be about saving the town, but actually the people who are really saving the town are people who are trying to put out the fire that the gunfight started. Like the outcome of the gunfight in McCabe and Mrs. Miller has no material impact
mhm,
on what happens to the survival of that town. Um, or in Heaven's Gate, which is one of my favorite classic revisionist westerns, is just to take the entirety of the idea of westward expansion and empire and just like focus on the ways in which it's just absolutely crushed the people
mm,
underneath the wheels of forward progress. So you take all those things, and those, along with just oversaturation, completely hollows out the Western genre, and it's got to
mhm,
have somewhere to go. And one of the places it finds roots is in the subsequent or the parallel rise
mhm,
of action cinema in the 70s. And, directors like Walter Hill, who,
mhm,
Refn is obviously referencing with Drive. I mean, he claims he never seen the Driver before he did Drive, but it's like, I don't believe that for
Yeah, I don't
one
believe it at all.
minute. Not 1 second do I believe that. There's the entire opening sequence is exactly the same.
Mhm.
So like, I think when you get to the 70s and you've got filmmakers who've grown up, and the two kinds of films that they really like watching when they were kids were Westerns because they were adventures, and noir films because they were dark and weird. And
mhm,
you take those two concepts and you combine them, and you take the Western hero and you dislocate him and put him into this urban space of noir, and you kind of see what happens. That's when you
mhm,
get action cinema. So it's the references in Death Wish, which is a
mhm,
noir space, but Kersey Bronson's character is constantly being
mhm,
reminded of Western tropes, and the police chief was going to let him skate, kind of tells him get out
mhm,
of town, and Bronson looks at the camera and winks and says by sundown, like all these yeah, right, yeah, and the final
mhm,
moments of the film, the point to the camera and the shooting of the phony gun, like it's action cinema of that period accommodated the Western. It was
mhm,
totally appropriate space for those character types, those ideas, primarily where violence is the means of conflict resolution.
mhm,
Like that's really the key idea that Westerns are exploring in their variety of ways, is how do we use violence to solve problems? When is it appropriate? When is it not? action cinema kind of takes that mantle on in the
Mhm.
70s, and then when it enters into its classical period in the 80s, the answer is pretty much resoundingly yes, violence
Yeah.
is the right answer. The
Yeah.
70s one's a little more ambivalent about that, but yeah.
Well, and I think we still see that to this day. I mean,
Mhm.
the biggest franchise in the world is the Fast and the Furious.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned how like there was a time when it was westerns and musicals that were the easiest things to export. Now it's action, like big blockbuster action films and comedies. And
Hmm.
you can look at the Fast and the Furious franchise, and Dom is very much a sort of Western figure in a lot of ways. He's sort of
Hmm.
soft, like he's not soft spoken, but he's like he lets his actions do more talking for him
Mhm.
than anything else. And instead of horses, they're just riding their souped up cars and all this
Which
sort
have
of
a lot
stuff,
of horsepower.
which have a lot of horsepower in
Mhm.
addition to the NOS and all that sort of
Mhm.
stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but it's pulling from a lot of the same sort of story templates in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
You get the person who's trying to steal a bunch of stuff, or they hire Dom and his family to steal something or whatever, and
Yeah.
and they're the only ones that can like save the day and all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And as it goes on, it gets more where they're sort of standing against the forces of chaos and keeping civilization safe and all that sort of stuff. So I think we still are seeing that phenomenon happening a lot. It's just things have gotten so much bigger and more bombastic in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
Which does kind of make me wonder, like, if the more classic approach to the Western, the return to, the more traditional settings of a cattle ranch or the desert or things like that, if one of the reasons why there still might be an audience out there for that is that it is in some way counter programming to those more spectacle laden blockbusters, because I think
Hmm.
that was one of the classic things about the westerns, is that you can go to a location, you can just go to a sound stage. You didn't really need a lot of those, what we might think of as even physical special effects. And today, with the preponderance of CGI and the increasingly poor quality of the CGI, it it might be that these types of throwbacks are refreshing in some
Hmm.
way.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite contemporary films that I would classify as a Western that fits into a lot of these kind of broader categories is certainly kind of got elements of noir. It's got elements of action cinema. Is Sicario?
Mhm.
Just to think about it, from Sheridan, who obviously is the screenwriter of Sicario and the screenwriter of the second film as well. And I believe that they are there's the Sicario machine is humming a little bit, so I think they're talking about doing a third one. Um, which I think Taylor Sheridan is somebody who obviously has a deep understanding of that part of the country,
Mm,
and is steeped in the the stories that are set in that part of the country.
mhm,
And his approach in a film like Sicario with the screenplay, and I think this is leavened a little bit by Denis Villeneuve, who's the director of that, is a kind of meditation on some of the same themes that Westerns are primarily about that I was talking about a moment ago, which is about like when is violence appropriate?
mhm,
Um, and I think that one thing that Sicario is most effective at is it's a very violent film that is about violence
mm,
in some really interesting ways. Like Villeneuve as a filmmaker is often more interested in the moments that lead up to
mm,
violence. There's a great sequence in the middle of Sicario where the convoy of people with Emily Blunt as the FBI agent and
mhm,
Benicio del Toro as the kind of CIA assassin have gone south of the border into Mexico to retrieve an informant, and then they have to go back across the
mm,
border north to America, and they get stuck on the crossing because there's a traffic jam caused by a car that has its engine is overheated, and so there's this long line of cars, and they're stuck in it, and they know because Del Toro's character has already said it that if we're going to get attacked, it's going to happen at the crossing, and
mm,
so Emily Blunt, who is sort of a newbie in this area and is somebody who doesn't really know exactly what she's gotten into, um, is is kind of your identification character who's shocked and horrified by the degree to which, the ease with which Benicio del Toro's character, and by extension, Josh Brolin's character, who's the kind of supervisor, um, the ease with which they use deadly force. Just how willing they are to execute anybody who stops them, anybody who gets in their way. And the way that the Brolin's organization, his sort of shadowy group of government operatives and CIA agents and whoever he's working for, are willing to use violence as a political tool to keep the cartels in this kind of chaotic maelstrom of violence and self-dealing and fighting each other. It's an extension of what Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name is doing in Fistful of Dollars, which is using one part of the criminal organization to fight another, just to keep them busy until they kill each other. I think this is basically on a geopolitical level what the policy is that Brolin's character and his organization are pursuing in a film like Sicario. I think Sicario is a really accomplished film in a variety of ways, just skillfully directed and just excellently staged, and just a whole bunch of other great aspects to it. But I think one way that it really is pretty masterful is the way in which it's exploring and extending some of these ideas that we might find in both classic and revisionist Westerns. I think it's kind of a fusion of some of those things in some interesting ways.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. Actually, that was very astute. But I think, that idea of something like Sicario coming along and really interrogating like the sort of geopolitical issues that are going on in the day. I think it's fascinating. And I think this has always kind of been the case, but the I don't want to put it, the right-wing nationalist embrace of the Western. I think I can't remember the guy's name, the guy who did Bone Tomahawk.
Oh yeah, S. Craig Zahler.
S. Craig Zahler, and how, his follow-up film was the Brawl, was it Brawl in Cell Block 99? Was that the title?
Brawl in Cell Block 99, and then the third one is Dragged Across Country. Yep.
Yeah, and he's very much this kind of, like, I don't know what his politics are off the top of my head, but his films are very much in the vein of something like Death Wish, in that they're these kind of reactionary screeds, and they really sort of position, traditional values and traditional manhood and all this stuff, and solving your problems with violence and all that sort of thing. And I think we see that a lot in the culture wars. And I think in a lot of ways, I do think Westerns are often sort of associated with that type of mindset, especially because of people like Clint Eastwood or people like John Wayne, and Ronald Reagan, who are, kind of poster boys for the Republicans or the right wing or whatever. And you can even see it in the fact that what was her name from Mandalorian? Gina Carano, was that the transphobe from she, her first film after being fired by Disney and prevented from working was with Ben Shapiro's company, and it was a Western. And it was like they wanted to have this sort of traditional story that they were going to tell that really sort of reinforced American values, without understanding the fact that most Westerns, not all, but most Westerns they're exploring the idea of American identity, or civilization versus the wild frontier and all this stuff. They're exploring them in much more nuanced ways, if not entirely like deconstructing and critiquing a lot of those ideas, like a lot of the Italian Westerns did, or like Refn, I think, is doing with a lot of his films and that sort of thing. So I think it's we're not just seeing like Westerns sort of interrogating a lot of geopolitical issues, but also like culture war issues, more and more so, I think, in the 21st century because of the perception of them.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. I think that like it's obvious. I think the reasons that like people on the right, as in directionally right side of the political spectrum are attracted to Westerns, I think, are because they tend to towards a traditional set of values, certain depictions of masculinity, of course, as you
Mhm.
mentioned, and you know your your enterprising capitalists who have the whole spread of land, and those kinds of characters that appeal to conservatives, I think, are replete in Westerns. They're everywhere. So I think that the reasons that they gravitate towards those genres make a lot of sense to me. I think that when you look at individual examples of films, even by filmmakers who are known to be conservative politically in their personal politics, Eastwood is a great example. I think
Mhm.
that his films are far more complicated than his
Mhm.
personal politics probably are. I think in particular of the outlaw Josie Wales, which he
Mhm.
took over as director. Like, he fired Philip Kaufman, the kind of lefty Bay Area guy who was in charge of it, like he's like, I'm not interested in what you're doing. He canned him and took it over, even though he was doing starring duties as well. Um, and Josie Wales is such a visceral, violent film about vengeance, but it's simultaneously about the building of community. That, as Josie kind of goes west looking for the men who killed his family and left him for dead, he just keeps taking on more and more responsibility as he accumulates these like outcasts and weirdos and people who have been ejected from society, and building his own little community of weirdos and carnival circus freaks, Um, and I think that it's striking to me that a movie like that could simultaneously be really violent and visceral and reactionary, and yet have this like huge empathetic heart. And I think there's a fascinating moment late in Josie Wales where he has the opportunity. They're like threatened by a tribe of, I forget which tribe of Native Americans it is. It's might be Apaches or somebody, but I think it's Will Sampson who's the chief in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest who plays the part. But
Mhm.
he has this opportunity to fight this tribe, and he basically just rides up to them and is like, "What if we just didn't? What if we just didn't fight each other?" And the tribe guy, the chief, kind of goes, "Makes sense," I'm paraphrasing, of course, but basically they choose not to fight each other in this
Mhm.
really interesting way that you would sort of expect, like, well, it's Clint, Clint's going to
Mhm.
shoot everybody down here and he's going to be fine, but he's going to kill everybody in order to protect everybody else. But they choose nonviolence. And I think it's an example of the ways in which, whatever a person's personal politics may be, the art that they make, oftentimes because it's a product of tension, it's a product of compromise, it's a product of working with an actor, working with a writer, working with a
Mhm.
cinematographer. Film can just by virtue of its very existence, it's a democratic act.
Mhm.
As much as we venerate the auteur, and like I do, I love auteurist, point of view, and I'm wearing my William Friedkin shirt, like I love thinking about cinema from an auteurist point of view. Like you cannot discount the democratic aspect of it
Mhm.
that I think results in a movie like The Outlaw Josie Wales or several of other of Clint Eastwood's movies where this is not a tract, it's not a thesis, it's a dialectic. It's an
Mhm.
exploration of this idea and this idea that are in tension, and we're going to see those two ideas sit alongside one another, and how they interact and intermingle. I think this is true of Dirty Harry. I think this is true of a
Mhm.
lot of Eastwood's films, both as director and as actor for Siegel and Leone and other people.
Mhm.
I mean, I think of like Unforgiven
Mhm.
and just how explicit that was in so many ways. Like the scene where it's the Morgan Freeman character and Clint Eastwood's character sitting around the fire, and
Mhm.
Eastwood's character is ruminating about how he shot some guy in the back of the head, blew his teeth out and stuff. And it's like he didn't deserve that.
Mhm.
And he's, showing all this sort of regret for it.
Yep.
And so I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think his films are doing so many really just interesting things in turn. To me, it's almost like when people misinterpret the Bruce Springsteen song Born in the USA. You
Yes.
know, and you have all these Republican candidates who use Born in the USA for their political theme songs and whatnot,
Hmm.
not realizing that it's like this real
Yeah.
heavy deconstruction of the American
Right.
ideal.
Mhm.
And I think that's what Eastwood's films and a lot of other people's films are doing, especially, you know, from like the 60s onward. I think you saw it in, you know, the sort of classical Hollywood Westerns as well. But I think from the 60s onward, as you had a lot of the rise of like protest movements and the counterculture and all that sort of stuff, you saw it more happening more and more. And it continued well into the 80s and 90s.
Hmm.
I think in some ways we're probably still seeing it with a lot of the films that are using Western tropes. But then I think of something like the Magnificent Seven remake with Chris Pratt, which was more just kind of, I mean, I like it. I thought it was a good movie for the most part, but it is kind of just a straightforward Hollywood action movie in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
It doesn't necessarily have a lot of the same preoccupations going on, I think.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know if I was making a point there, but just like discussing how we see this happening over again.
Yeah, I think that the idea that you ultimately have to wrestle with is like decline, right? Like, is this in decline as a real valuable system of meaning in cinema in an industrial space? And I don't know. I think the jury's kind of out on that, you know? I mean, we started this conversation talking about cycles, right? And you know, thinking about whether or not a recognizable classic looking Western will come back as any kind of major cultural force in the next 20 to 30 years. I kind of don't know, you know. I mean, has the iconography and the generic conventions of Westerns, have they been so deeply fractured into all these pieces that they're now just like kind of things that people take off the shelf when they need to communicate something in a shorthand that audiences will easily recognize whether they've seen a classic Western or not, you know, because the generic iconography is just so recognizable. I don't know. Can you put all those pieces back together again in any systemic way? Is really tough to say, you know. Is it kind of permanently relegated to like, oh, we get a Western every now and then, but for the most part, it lives in other spaces and they dress in other clothes and they drive cars and, you know, they fly in spacesuits or whatever.
Mm.
I don't know, you know. I think that's remains to be seen, whether or not Westerns will be able to kind of reconstitute like the T-1000 when all the liquid comes back and he's back. You know, I don't know.
I wonder if it might have to be that the cycles in some way sync up with cycles of American ascendancy, and that sense of if the American empire is doing well, then
Hmm.
we see more of the classical monomyth stories coming out then too.
Yeah.
And I think we saw that, you know, turn of the, you know, beginning of the 20th century. You definitely saw it after World War II. You saw it under Reagan in the 1980s into the 1990s to an extent. And I think post 9/11, you're seeing that big questioning of what is America's stage on the world. And right now with the Israeli Hamas conflict, and there's so much contradiction or conflict in the country about what should be the America's role in all of this. And do we need to still be the police? Do we need to still have the military we have? I think there's a lot of that questioning of what is America's position in the world.
Hmm.
And if, which is, you know, it's kind of why MAGA exists. And if there's too much of that questioning, if people don't see the American power, I don't think that you're going to have those types of classical Westerns. I think the mixing makes a lot more sense than at that point. But
Hmm.
then I was also thinking maybe it's okay that it's mixing because it does allow different forms of the commentary that I think is necessary
Hmm.
for the American empire and for the critique of what has helped the American empire to come to exist.
Hmm.
And I'm also now thinking, thanks to Wong Fu, thanks for everything. Julie Newmar is a Western to some extent.
Sure. Yeah.
I think and having it that way and seeing people taking these conventions and altering them for a new look at an American identity is what America needs if it is going to ascend again.
Mhm. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the two options. If you really think about it, every Hollywood production is kind of a Western in some way because of how rooted in American culture the Western is. And so elements of it probably sneak into a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And I also think about, this idea of is it going to rise again? I don't know if it's going to rise again, but for a long time there, people thought horror was dead too. Horror like went through that cycle where suddenly it was all self-reflexive type stuff, and like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer and things like that. And then after 9/11, we saw this kind of resurgence of more traditional types of horror and less sort of winking, ironic type of horror. And now we're in like the elevated horror phase, which I don't like that term, but it is what it is. And we could maybe at some point, see the Western do the same sort of thing.
And it kind of makes sense that maybe when one is up, the other is down, because they are both dealing, like with what Brian was saying, they're both dealing with threat and resolution. It's just with the horror, the resolution isn't necessarily good, and it's meant to reflect the anxiety that the culture and society you're feeling at the time. But and they're definitely. But I also think that
really had you noticed that?
Yeah.
A little bit. I mean, it's it's not so obvious, but it's kind of there.
But also saying that idea of maybe there's elements of the Western throughout Hollywood is possibly also a reflection of how Hollywood came to be, because Hollywood was part of that Western expansion. So it kind of makes sense that maybe you would see the storytelling and the mythology of the Western that arose during the westward expansion of the late 1800s emerging through the formation of Hollywood in the early 1900s.
All goes back to the Great Train Robbery. So.
Yeah, there you go.
We are at the hour, so maybe just one last thing is there a modern Western, I can't talk today, something maybe from within the past 5 years, maybe decade, that you would recommend people check out?
Well, I kind of already used mine. I would say Sicario. I think that's the one that I would point to as really reckoning with some of these ideas in some interesting ways that both linger back to the classical period and to the revisionist period of the 70s.
Yeah, I don't know about within the last decade. One that I would point to, but it is problematic in a lot of ways, but it is also a pretty good movie. But I liked Bone Tomahawk. I thought Bone Tomahawk was pretty good. I can see where people would have critiques with how it portrays indigenous peoples and things like that. I don't want to get into that right now because it would take a whole other hour.
Yeah.
But I would go back and point to just, No Country for Old Men, which is a little bit outside of that decade window, but it's pretty close. And that movie, that's just a great movie. It's really interesting in terms of how it takes the tropes and applies it to the sort of the neo-noir genre in a lot of ways. And it's the Coen brothers. The Coen brothers are excellent. And yeah, I don't know. I'm still kind of just waiting to see what happens with another Cormac McCarthy novel, if they ever get my brain just blanked on it. His Western.
Blood Meridian.
Blood Meridian. I don't know why my brain just
Yeah.
But
a lot of people have tried to wrestle that thing to the ground. I don't know if they're going to do it.
I'm like, well, I just kind of want to wait and see what happens there.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be one to recommend. I don't know.
I'm going to go the sci-fi route, and I'm going to say, look at The Mandalorian, look at Ahsoka, and look at how those characters are being, in some ways, positioned as those Western figures, and what it means to the overall idea of the mythos of Star Wars as relating to Westerns too. Because I think, especially in comparison to the newer trilogy, which I think Mandalorian and Ahsoka did more to harken back to that idea of the space Western. And I think that's an interesting idea to consider how it relates to the space Western compared to the first trilogy.
Okay.
Right. All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for listening, whether it is currently or, whenever you get to it. All right, how do I stop with the whole, I know.